How did you figure out you had PMDD? I had been ill with numerous different mental health illnesses since the age of 11. These had been diagnosed as anorexia, depression, anxiety, deliberate self-harm. And this one particular week, I was really struggling with my eating disorder. My mum was giving me 24/7 care because I was that distressed and distraught and irrational at that point in time. And she'd been looking after me on the Friday night, the Saturday and the Sunday. And then on the Monday morning, she got me an urgent GP appointment because she was like, we can't do this anymore, we need some more support. So I went to see the GP and I couldn't give her eye contact. All I could think was that I wanted to put an end to the distress that I was in, and I didn't care about what route that took, even if that meant doing something that would potentially end my life. I just needed to numb out the distress. And people were quite concerned about my well-being at that stage. So the GP gave my mum some advice, and she gave me some additional medications to take to try and help calm me down. And she said for my mum to stay with me, and also that, my mum could ring up for additional support if we needed it. What we decided to do as a family to try and distract me was to carry on with our plans. And instead of me going off to see my cousin on my own, my mum and my auntie came with me so that I could be in the presence of people and feel relatively safe, whilst also not having to interact with anybody, because at that point I was so distressed that I couldn't maintain a conversation and I didn't want to look at anybody and I felt completely worthless. So we went to my cousin's house, and throughout the day, my mum and my auntie said they just literally saw me change as a person. And because I'd been so distressed that day, my GP had asked to see me again the next day so that she could monitor how I was doing. And the next day I went into the GP office and I was able to give her eye contact. I had a conversation with her, which I couldn't do the day before. I was sat still, I wasn't really anxious, and my mood had lifted tremendously. And for a long time we had been talking about how we thought there might be a cyclical element or a hormonal element to my mental health and my distress. And as we were talking, the GP said to me, what do you think's changed? And it came out, in the last 24 hours I came on my period. And that was it. My GP was like, I know what is wrong with you. I'm sure I know what's wrong with you. You have got a condition called premenstrual dysphoric disorder. And if I'm honest, I was really skeptical. I'd been given so many labels for different illnesses, and I tried so many different medications and talking therapies that I thought, that's it, just whack another label on. It's not actually going to make any difference. Label with what you like, I don't care. I'm willing to give it a go. So I am quite lucky in the sense that I didn't have to fight for my diagnosis. And I remember the day of my diagnosis very, very vividly. So there and then in the doctor's surgery, she did some blood tests because she wanted to rule out if there was any hormonal imbalances or any other underlying conditions that could be picked up in my blood work. And that all came back within normal ranges, and there was nothing to worry about. So she referred me to a gynecologist. And a couple of weeks later, I went to see the gynecologist and I took my symptom tracking diary because I'd been doing that anyway. I had been tracking my mental health on a blog for years, and I'd obviously just been tracking my periods anyway. So I just married the two up, and you could see a very distinct pattern. And my GP wrote everything that she'd seen, and I talked to the gynecologist, and within an hour of being with the gynecologist, I had a diagnosis of PMDD, and I was started on treatment. So the next question is, have you been officially diagnosed? So my answer to that is yes, I have been officially diagnosed. I was diagnosed in 2016, just before my 27th birthday, and it was a life-changing moment for me. How was the response from the medical community when starting treatment? I received a really positive response from my physical health team. So my GP, my gynecologist, and all the people that I saw in terms of my physical health. However, I was under a lot of mental health services, and they struggled. A lot of the mental health team had never heard of PMDD, let alone treated anybody with PMDD, and they were very sceptical. They were really good with me though, and we worked together to learn about PMDD. We looked at lots of research articles and began to teach ourselves about the menstrual cycle and the hormones and actually what PMDD is. And then it became very evident for me personally, every time progesterone was added in, I became very unwell. So we started to begin to plan my care around when I had to take the progesterone, and that was really helpful. And then when the mental health community had a lot more understanding of PMDD, they were able to say that yes, this is a valid diagnosis, and actually we think that this is influencing your mental health a lot. They were very good about trying to care plan around it and validating that. I think one of the things that I found most frustrating for myself was I found that I was compartmentalized. So the gynecologist would be telling me that all my distress was because of my hormones, and the psychological team were saying it was all because of past trauma, and the mental health team was saying, oh, it's just a mixture of your mental health diagnoses, and maybe it's a little bit worse because of the PMDD, but you've definitely got psychological and mental health issues alongside this. That's just exacerbating it. And it felt like my GP was the only one that could see the whole of me and see that it didn't really matter what the label was, as long as we worked together to keep me alive and to then help me get a better quality of life. It didn't matter what the label was. What are the symptoms that are hardest to deal with? It's really tricky. I think for me, in my PMDD, the hardest thing was the distress and the anxiety and the feeling of being completely overwhelmed and out of my depth. And that feeling just made me want to do anything to get out of that place in my mind. And that meant I was doing things like self-harming, taking overdoses, and engaging in behaviours which were putting my life at risk on a monthly basis. And that just couldn't continue. Have you ever experienced any major life events as a result of PMDD? Yes. When I was going through my PMDD, the chemical menopause began to fail for me, and I was having cyclical symptoms month in, month out, and my risk level was really high and they couldn't maintain my safety in the community. So I was actually admitted to a psychiatric inpatient hospital for almost a year whilst I awaited my surgery. So that was a major life event. And also when I was age 29, I underwent fertility treatment to collect my eggs, because the one thing that I really wanted in life and still really want in life was a family. And now, unfortunately, I'm not able to bear my own children because at the age of 29, I opted for a total hysterectomy with bilateral saphenlingu oophorectomy, which is basically a removal of your cervix, uterus, fallopian tubes and ovaries, because that was the final treatment option left for me, and it felt like the only way that I had any chance of having a life that wasn't destroyed by my hormones. And if that hadn't have been an option, I don't know if I would have wanted to continue living my life the way it was, because it was very bleak. It wasn't any quality of life. I had probably 4 or 5 good days a month, but by good days, I was so completely wiped out and exhausted by all the bad days that I was basically just chasing my tail the whole time. Has PMDD impacted your relationships? Yes, a lot. It massively impacted my relationships with my family, in the sense that I would fly off the handle. I was very impulsive at times. I struggled to process emotions because I was so irritable. It meant that there was a lot of tension in my family because they were always feeling like they were walking on eggshells, because they didn't know if when I was in PMDD mode, like they could say something that would have been absolutely fine to say the week before, but when I was in PMDD mode, it would just completely destroy me, and they were always quite afraid that I was going to go and self-destruct somewhere. So that was really difficult. It also caused a lot of distress amongst my family, because it's really hard if you have tried to take your life and then have to face your family again. That was a really difficult thing for me to go through, and it was also a really difficult thing for my family to watch me go through. It was then also really hard for me to talk to my family afterwards, because I'd feel so much guilt and shame, especially when it was happening time and time again. The other way it impacted me was with friendship circles. I never actually felt like I was part of the friendship circle. I always felt like an outcast, that I was like looking into a fishbowl at everybody else, and I was just on the circumference of it. I was really lucky because I worked really hard to maintain good friendships and keep those friendships going throughout my PMDD. It just often was a lot of hard work on my part to keep that going, and not to just retreat into thinking that I was worthless and that nobody liked me and that there was no point in me attending because I felt so bad about myself, and all the intrusive thoughts of how I perceived others thought about me. So that was really hard. Romantically, there was no romantic relationships. My life was far too unstable for romantic relationships. And whenever I started to get into a romantic relationship, I would completely freak out about my self-worth and how could anybody possibly like me, or goodness forbid love me, when I hated myself so much. So I would always push people away as soon as we started getting close. So there was never any real long-term relationships. So on the flip side to this, there was one positive aspect. So when I was really ill with my PMDD, I think in a lot of ways, although it strained my relationship with my family, in a lot of ways I think it also brought us closer together. Like, we ended up discussing things that we would have probably never discussed, and we understand each other a lot better now. How has PMDD impacted your life? Goodness, where do I even begin? So for me, one of the big things that was a problem was my eating and my self-harm. That was a really maladaptive way that I tried to cope with my PMDD, and this meant that my school years were disrupted. So I think it probably affected my education massively. How can you concentrate on your exams if all you're thinking about is food and calories and how much you hate yourself? It really had a significant impact when I went to university. So there were times when, because I was suicidal and because I was actively taking overdoses and making attempts at ending my life, that I had to be suspended from my studies. So I graduated a year after everybody else. Then I went on to get a job in my chosen career field. And again, I felt like PMDD robbed me of that, because after 3 years, I had to take a career break because basically I wasn't well enough to work anymore. And then because I wasn't working, it stopped me buying a house and progressing with my life. So although I'm very aware that life isn't a race, I sort of feel that I'm behind where I should be, or where I would like to be. But I'm just trying to be patient, and because I know things will work out okay in the end. What treatments have you tried? I feel like I tried all of them. So my journey, I started off on transdermal estrogen just to see if the increase in estrogen would at least stabilise my hormones a little bit. That made a really significant difference for me, but you're not able to stay on unopposed estrogen. So then I had the Mirena coil inserted. That has a progesterone base, and I was just constantly distressed, anxious and really suicidal for the whole 8 weeks that it was in. So although I wanted to continue and just try and ride it out and see if it got better, the gynecologist sort of overrode my decision and said, look, this is not going to get better just by riding it out. It looks like you're progesterone sensitive, and so she took it out after 8 weeks. Following that, I tried many different microgenized progesterones, both orally and vaginally, and that wasn't working. I tried taking it for a different length of time each month. I tried taking it at different doses, and I tried different routes of administration. So I tried taking it orally, and I also tried taking it vaginally at all different treatment doses and length of treatment days. And every time within 24, 48 hours of taking it, I would be completely distressed. My capacity would be wavering and I wouldn't be quite sure of what I was doing. I'd be acting really impulsively and doing things which were putting my life at risk. So then I was put into the chemical menopause and I went on Decapeptyl. The Decapeptyl worked at first, but then my cycle started to break through after about 6 months. So then I was put on the Zoladex, and again, the Zoladex, that worked at first, but as soon as we added progesterone in, I had the same situation again, that I was becoming really distressed and impulsive and self-destructive. And so then they put me in, so then they gave me what they called a 3-month progesterone holiday, just to simulate what it would be like if I was in chemical menopause with add-back estrogen, so what it would be like if I was to have a hysterectomy. And oh my goodness, it felt so surreal. It was the best 3 months of my life. I'd never felt like that ever in my adult life. I was like, just kept saying to my mum, is this what life's really like? Like, you mean to say what I've been feeling is not normal? I had never known any different. And so after that progesterone holiday, I had to start taking the progesterone again. And after that, that was when I had by that point decided that I wanted to opt for surgery as final stage treatment for my PMDD, because the Zoladex was becoming less and less effective. I was having to take it more and more regularly, and I couldn't not take the add-back progesterone, and going into hospital is not really a quality of life. And so in May 2019, I had a total laparoscopic hysterectomy and bilateral saphengoophorectomy. I'm also on a low dose of fluoxetine, which is a SSRI antidepressant, which is meant to help with PMDD because it's thought that the serotonin is linked to estrogen receptors. So when your estrogen dips, then your serotonin dips, and which is why then the serotonin in the antidepressant is helpful. Have you tried a treatment plan that works? Yes. Unfortunately for me, the treatment plan that worked was surgery. And that was a really difficult and personal decision to make at the age of 29. But so far, I'm a year post-op and I have no regrets. I'm not going to say that surgical menopause is not difficult. There's plenty of ups and downs, but for me, it's definitely a lot better than PMDD. I'm able to live independently again. I'm able to go to work. I'm able to drive again. And I haven't made any attempts at ending my life or being self-destructive since the surgery. So for me, that's a massive win. So I'm in the surgical menopause. That doesn't stop you being hormone sensitive, but it does stop the natural fluctuations in your sex hormones. So I have add-back estrogen and add-back testosterone and no progesterone. Why is exposure about PMDD important? Exposure about PMDD is important because an average of 12 years to a diagnosis, seeing multiple doctors, is just not acceptable. There's many individuals out there struggling just like I was, probably being misdiagnosed, and without the right diagnosis, you can't access the right treatment. You can be put on as many psychiatric drugs as they like, but unless you sort the underlying issue out, it's not going to fix you. You're not going to feel any relief and you're not going to get better. Yes, they might sedate the symptoms, they might help numb the distress, but until I got my PMDD diagnosis and was put on hormone treatment, none of the meds made a significant enough difference to make me have a life worth living and want to be alive. For me, hormones were really the thing that was the underlying issue. And once that was sorted, I started to slowly make progress with everything else to do with my mental health and be able to manage my urges a lot better. And with a 30% suicide attempt rate, we've got to get people diagnosed and treated sooner. 12 years to a diagnosis and visiting multiple doctors. It's just not acceptable. We need to increase the awareness, increase the screening in psychiatric services, and we need to get ladies and individuals diagnosed much sooner so that it doesn't impact as much as their life as it has impacted mine.